Consumed by diseases of their own consanguinity, this was the most deformed family in Alabama. Hidden among the isolated valleys and dense forests of Winston County, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there existed a family whose name still sends chills through the local population. Not only were the Blackwoods known for their voluntary isolation from the outside world, but also for the terrible genetic legacy they carried for generations. This is the story of how one of the most genetically deformed lineages ever documented in the American medical history of the 1950s emerged from the intertwining of family blood. It was in April 1957 that the case of the Blackwoods came to light, when a rural doctor named Dr. James Harrington was called to an emergency on a remote property in the hills. His perception of the limits of human degradation would be forever changed by what he found. On that property of about 40 acres lived approximately 32 people, all belonging to the same family tree, distributed among 3 small wooden houses. "What I saw that day will haunt me for the rest of my life," Dr. Harrington reported in his medical records, which were later released after his death in 1983. He described children with atrophied limbs, adults with distorted facial features, and a pattern of mental deficiencies that repeated in virtually all the family's younger members. The location of the Blackwood property was so remote, about 14 miles from the nearest town in Winston County, that they rarely received visitors. Even mail carriers avoided the area, leaving correspondence in an improvised box on the main road. Known for his hostility toward strangers was the family patriarch, Elijah Blackwood, then 67 years old, who exercised rigid control over his descendants. Subsistence farming was how the Blackwoods lived, growing corn, potatoes, and some vegetables on rocky and fertile land. They raised pigs and chickens, rarely going to town for essential supplies. The isolation wasn't just geographic, it was also cultural and genetic. An isolation that had begun 3 generations earlier with the arrival of the first Blackwood to that region around 1880. Dr. Harrington had been called to attend to Martha Blackwood, a 16-year-old girl in complicated labor. She was both granddaughter and niece to Elijah, the product of a union between his daughter and his own brother. Severe malformations were present in the baby, including polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, microcephaly, an abnormally small head, and congenital heart problems that led to its death just 48 hours after birth. Just the starting point for the discovery of an alarming case of family consanguinity extending for at least 4 generations was this tragic event. An unbreakable tradition among the Blackwoods had become the practice of marriages between close relatives, justified by Elijah as a way to maintain the purity of the family blood and protect their lands from outsiders. The initial investigation revealed that 27 of the 32 family members presented some type of physical or cognitive anomaly. Among the most common conditions were severe facial deformities, including underdeveloped jaws and malformations of the palate. Reduced stature, with adults rarely exceeding 5 feet 3 inches in height. Intellectual disability, ranging from mild to severe. Vision problems, including partial or total blindness in approximately 40% of members. Congenital heart diseases. Limb malformations such as fused or extra fingers. In his notes, Dr. Harrington described William Blackwood, one of Elijah's sons, then 42 years old, as having an asymmetrical face with eyes set far apart, a significantly underdeveloped jaw, and an abnormal curvature of the spine that made him appear significantly shorter than he actually was. Coarse facial features were presented by his wife and also first cousin, Sarah Blackwood, including a widened and flattened nose, thick lips, and small, deep-set eyes. Of the couple's 6 children, 4 presented severe intellectual disability, unable to articulate complete sentences even as adults. The most disturbing aspect, according to the doctor's reports, was how the family seemed to accept these conditions as normal. "They don't see these deformities as a problem, but as a family characteristic," he wrote. When questioned about marriages between close relatives, Elijah responded with disconcerting naturalness that, "It has always been this way and always will be." Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Truths about our humanity that few have the courage to confront are revealed by these dark stories of isolated communities. You won't want to miss any of our next cases, documented with the same care and depth. Darker still becomes the story of the Blackwoods when we look at their origins. Historical records indicate that the first Blackwood to arrive in that region was Isaiah Blackwood around 1880, fleeing from accusations of crimes never clarified in the state of Tennessee. Isaiah brought with him his wife, 2 teenage daughters, and a small son, establishing himself in the remote mountains of Winston County, deliberately seeking isolation. A local census from 1890 already recorded that the family had grown significantly with 11 members living on the same property. What the records don't explicitly show, but which later investigations revealed, is that this growth didn't just occur through the arrival of new members, but through the birth of children resulting from relationships between the family members themselves. Rejected correspondence from distant relatives who tried to maintain contact is shown in letters found on the property dated 1910, with handwritten responses by Isaiah stating, "We don't need anyone. We are self-sufficient and pure. The outside world would only bring corruption to our lineage." From approximately the third generation in 1920, the first evident signs of the genetic impact of this practice began to emerge. Although scarce due to the family's reluctance to seek medical assistance, local medical records show births of children with increasingly severe malformations. I was called to the Blackwood property after a difficult birth. The child presented a condition I had never seen before, multiple malformations in the limbs and face and an almost animalistic behavior from the mother who refused to let me properly examine the newborn, documented Dr. Ernest Miller, a doctor who occasionally attended emergencies in the region during the 1930s, in his personal diary. The child's father, who I discovered was also the mother's cousin, showed similar signs of atypical facial development. The isolation of the Blackwoods was only intensified by the Great Depression of the 1930s. While many rural families in Alabama were forced to migrate to urban centers in search of work, the Blackwoods entrenched themselves even more on their property, surviving through subsistence farming and hunting. This period also marked the beginning of Elijah's leadership, who took control of the family after his father's death in 1932. Under Elijah's command, the practices of consanguineous union not only continued but were actively encouraged. Local school records show that the few Blackwood children who came to attend the county school in the 1940s were withdrawn after a few months. The Blackwood children demonstrate significant difficulties in learning and socialization. In addition, they present distinctive physical characteristics that make them targets of ridicule by their peers, recorded a teacher from that time, Mrs. Dorothy Wilkins, in school reports. The children stopped attending after complaints from Elijah Blackwood about the treatment received by his children and nephews. The isolation wasn't just a matter of personal choice but also a response to growing stigmatization. An almost superstitious fear of the Blackwoods was developed by residents of the region, with exaggerated stories about their appearances and behaviors spreading throughout the county. Terms commonly used to refer to the family were deformed creatures living in the mountains, or the cursed people of the hills. A significant incident occurred in 1945 when 2 young Blackwoods, Joseph and Daniel, cousins and also half-brothers, went down to town to buy supplies. Such a commotion was caused by their appearance that they were chased out of the local grocery store by frightened customers. The boys did not demonstrate aggressive behavior, just extremely unusual appearance, eyes set very far apart, protruding jaws, and a form of communication almost incomprehensible between them. I had to escort them back to the mountains to avoid further confrontations, recorded the local sheriff, Thomas Walsh, of the incident. Elijah's determination to keep his family completely isolated from the outside world was only solidified by this event. In the following years between 1945 and 1957, the Blackwoods were rarely seen in town, with the exception of Elijah and his oldest son, Robert, who occasionally went down to buy essential items such as salt, ammunition, and tools. World War II, which led many young men from Alabama to enlist or be drafted, did not directly affect the Blackwoods. No family member served in the armed forces, partly due to their physical and intellectual conditions and partly due to their invisibility in official records. A phantom population that existed on the margins of American society was created as many births and deaths within the family were never officially registered. It was in this context of extreme isolation, social stigmatization, and consanguineous marriage practices established for generations that Dr. Harrington found the family in 1957 when he was called to assist in the complicated birth of Martha Blackwood. Facing an ethical and professional dilemma found Dr. James Harrington when he returned to town after his first contact with the Blackwoods. As a doctor, he immediately recognized the classic characteristics of a population with a high rate of consanguinity. But he also realized he was facing an extreme case that could significantly contribute to medical knowledge about the genetic effects of these practices. After discreetly consulting with colleagues from the University of Alabama, Harrington gained the support of Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist who had studied similar cases, although less severe, in isolated communities in Europe. In June 1957, 2 months after the initial incident, the two doctors returned to the Blackwood property, this time with a carefully planned approach. "We couldn't simply arrive and announce our study intentions," wrote Thompson in his subsequent report. "We approached by offering free medical assistance and medications, knowing the family had little or no access to regular health care." Initially hostile, Elijah Blackwood eventually allowed the doctors to examine some family members, especially after realizing that his granddaughter Martha was still suffering from postpartum complications that weren't healing properly. This opening, albeit limited, allowed the doctors to initiate what would become one of the first documented studies on the extreme effects of consanguinity in an isolated population in the United States. Over 3 subsequent visits, always under the pretext of medical follow-up, the doctors managed to collect crucial data. Partial medical history of 27 family members. Anthropometric measurements of 19 individuals. Photographic documentation with reluctant permission of 12 members. Blood samples from 8 people for basic laboratory analyses. The technological limitations of the time did not allow for the sophisticated genetic tests available today. But even with basic methods, the results were alarming. High levels of homozygosity, the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents, a clear indicator of consanguinity, were revealed by blood analyses. "What we are observing in the Blackwoods," wrote Dr. Thompson in his 1957 notes, "is a dramatic amplification of recessive traits that would normally remain dormant in populations with greater genetic diversity. Each generation intensified these traits, creating a cascade effect that resulted in the severe physical and cognitive manifestations we have documented." Among the specific conditions identified were Apert syndrome, premature fusion of skull bones, present in at least 6 members. Polydactyly, extra digits, in 11 individuals. Intellectual disability in approximately 70% of the family, ranging from mild to profound. Achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, in 8 members. Hemophilia in 3 men of the family. Retinitis pigmentosa, progressive degeneration of the retina, in almost 40% of individuals. An alarming infant mortality rate was also revealed by the study. Approximately 60% of babies born into the family in the last 2 generations did not survive beyond the first year of life. Those who survived often developed multiple debilitating conditions throughout childhood. One of the most impressive cases documented was that of Samuel Blackwood, 19 years old, son of William and Sarah. A rare combination of conditions was presented by the young man: severe microcephaly, an extremely underdeveloped jaw, multiple extra fingers on both hands, vision limited to the perception of light and shadow, and a stature that did not exceed 4 feet 7 inches. Despite these physical limitations, Samuel demonstrated surprising musical abilities, being able to reproduce complex melodies on the banjo after hearing them only once. Cases like Samuel's represent the complexity of human genetics, Thompson observed. Even in conditions of extreme genetic limitation, unique and unexpected characteristics can emerge, reminding us of the unpredictability of gene expression. During one of the visits, a deeper dialogue with Abigail Blackwood, 52 years old, Elijah's sister and one of the few people in the family who had had significant contact with the outside world in her youth, was managed by Dr. Harrington. Abigail revealed that when young, she had briefly worked as a domestic servant in Huntsville, returning to the family property only when her father fell ill. "They don't know what they're doing to themselves," she confided to the doctor. I see our children being born weaker and stranger with each generation. I tried to talk to Elijah about bringing new blood into the family, but he says the outside world will corrupt us. He doesn't realize we're withering from within. Have you ever wondered what secrets isolated families hide on their remote properties? Leave in the comments. The mountains hold truths that society prefers to ignore. Your participation helps us continue bringing these impactful stories that few have the courage to tell. In August 1957, the doctors presented their preliminary findings at a small medical conference in Birmingham, maintaining the family's anonymity for ethical reasons, referring to them only as Family X from Northern Alabama. Considerable interest in the regional medical community was caused by the presentation, but it also raised ethical questions about intervention. We are facing a population that voluntarily isolated itself and maintains practices that clearly result in physical suffering for subsequent generations, argued Dr. Thompson during the conference. As health professionals, do we have an obligation to intervene, or should we respect their cultural autonomy even when it results in severe genetic damage? The fall of 1957 marked a turning point in the history of the Blackwoods. After the presentation at the medical conference, the case attracted the discreet attention of public health authorities from the state of Alabama. A small multidisciplinary team to assess the situation, including a social worker, a public health nurse, and a legal representative, was sent by the state health department, concerned with the implications of the case. Open hostility was met by the arrival of these authorities at the Blackwood property in October 1957. Wielding a shotgun, Elijah initially refused to allow them onto the property. The intervention of Dr. Harrington, who had gained a minimum of trust from the family, was necessary to mediate the situation. "You have no right to interfere in how we live," Elijah shouted at the team, as later reported. "Our land, our rules. We've been here for 3 generations and nobody ever cared about us before." Precarious living conditions in the 3 houses on the property were documented by the public health team: absence of running water or electricity, rudimentary sanitary facilities that contaminated the family's water well, and general hygiene conditions that aggravated existing health problems. 5 school-aged children received no form of formal education, and several family members presented treatable medical conditions that had been neglected for years. "We found a family living in conditions that go back a century both in material terms and social practices," described the official report written by social worker Margaret Collins. "The children show evident signs of chronic malnutrition, aggravating the congenital conditions already present. Several adults suffer from easily treatable diseases such as severe dental infections and chronic respiratory problems without any medical intervention." A complex dilemma was placed before the authorities by the situation. On one hand, there were clear violations of child welfare and public health laws. On the other, forced intervention could traumatize an already fragile and isolated community. After intense deliberations, a gradual approach was opted for by the health department, starting with offers of immediate medical assistance and education before considering more drastic measures. However, unexpected events accelerated the intervention process. A strong storm hit the region in November 1957, causing a landslide that partially destroyed one of the houses on the property. 2 family members were seriously injured and transported to the county hospital, marking the first time many of the younger Blackwoods had left the family property. An opportunity to intervene more directly was provided by this incident. While the injured received treatment, social workers were able to talk with other family members who accompanied them to the hospital, including 3 teenagers who demonstrated curiosity about the outside world. Rachel Blackwood, 16 years old, with less severe facial deformities than other family members but with mild intellectual disability, expressed her desire to properly learn to read. "I know I'm different," she told the social worker. "But I want to know things that are in books. Dad says we don't need that, but I dream of knowing what's written on the boxes we bring from town." This openness from some younger family members, combined with the practical need for assistance after the landslide, created a breach in the isolation the family had maintained for decades. An agreement was negotiated in December 1957. The county would offer materials to rebuild the damaged house and ongoing medical assistance in exchange for permission for the school-aged children to receive basic education from a teacher who would visit the property 3 times a week. Mainly due to pressure from other adult family members who had glimpsed the benefits of contact with the outside world after the landslide incident, Elijah reluctantly accepted. This small concession marked the beginning of a slow transformation. The designated teacher, Esther Jenkins, an experienced educator of 58 who had worked with isolated rural communities throughout her career, began her visits in January 1958. An intimate glimpse of this process is offered by her personal diary, later donated to the County Historical Archive. My first day with the Blackwood children was a challenge like no other in my 30 years of teaching. 5 children between 7 and 16 years old, non-literate, all with some degree of cognitive and physical disability. But what impressed me most was their hunger for knowledge, an almost desperate hunger for information about a world that had been denied to them. Little Timothy, 9 years old, with his extra fingers and asymmetrical face, spent almost an hour fascinated with a globe I brought. "Are we really so small in the world?" he asked with eyes wide with astonishment. A noticeable impact began to have the regular presence of Teacher Jenkins and occasional visits from health professionals throughout 1958. 3 of the children learned to read at a basic level. Chronic medical conditions were treated, and gradually Elijah's initial hostility diminished, although he maintained his distrust of the outside world. A significant turning point occurred in September 1958 when Martha Blackwood, the young woman whose complicated birth had initiated the whole discovery process, expressed her desire to leave the property and seek treatment for her persistent health conditions. At 17 years old and now literate thanks to Mrs. Jenkins's classes, Martha had developed an understanding that her life could be different. "I don't want anyone else in our family to suffer as we have suffered," Martha told Dr. Harrington during a consultation. "If what you say is true about our problems coming from marriages between relatives, then I need to leave here." A crisis in the family was triggered by Martha's decision to leave the property, accompanied by 2 teenage cousins. Elijah initially threatened to use force to prevent them, but the intervention of the local sheriff and the mediation of Dr. Harrington resulted in a tense agreement. The young women would be allowed to leave as long as they remained under the supervision of social workers and maintained regular contact with the family. The beginning of the gradual dissolution of the extreme isolation that had defined the Blackwoods for generations was marked by this event. In the following years between 1958 and 1965, more than half of the younger family members chose to leave the property, many seeking medical treatment for their conditions in specialized institutions or integrating to the extent possible into the broader society. Profound changes in the history of the Blackwoods were witnessed by the early 1960s. The property that had been an isolated enclave for almost 80 years began to gradually open to the outside world. Not only the loss of his absolute authority but also a reality that contradicted everything he had believed for decades was faced by Elijah Blackwood, the inflexible patriarch. A stroke was suffered by Elijah in January 1962, which left him partially paralyzed and dependent on care, a situation ironically symbolic for a man who had valued independence and isolation so much. Under the care of his sister Abigail and with regular medical assistance now available, he lived 5 more years, passing away in 1967 at the age of 77. Transformations that he certainly considered the destruction of his way of life were witnessed by Elijah during these last years of life. Leadership of the family was assumed by William, his eldest son, who, influenced by new ideas brought by health professionals and educators, began to implement significant changes on the property. The main house was renovated with social assistance funds, gaining basic plumbing and electricity in 1963. An improved access road was built the same year, allowing vehicles to reach the property even during periods of heavy rain. The younger children began to attend the local school, albeit with special support due to their specific needs. Dr. Walter Thompson, who had begun his studies with the family in 1957, continued following the case of the Blackwoods for more than 2 decades. A seminal article entitled Multi-Generational Effects of Consanguinity in Isolated Populations, a case study from rural Alabama, was published by him in 1972 in the American Journal of Human Genetics. The article, which maintained the family's anonymity using the pseudonym Alpha Family, meticulously documented the genetic effects observed over 5 generations. A reference in the field of population genetics became Thompson's work, contributing significantly to the scientific understanding of the effects of prolonged inbreeding in human populations. Among the most significant findings documented by Thompson were: the progressively more severe expression of recessive genetic conditions with each generation. The emergence of rare combinations of conditions that are rarely observed in populations with greater genetic diversity. The dramatic reduction in fertility and viability of births in recent generations. The occurrence of unexpected characteristics in some individuals, such as specific talents amid widespread disabilities. The improvement in general health and development of the younger family members after the intervention of 1957–58 was also documented by the study. Children who received adequate nutrition, medical care, and education showed better cognitive and physical development compared to their older siblings and cousins, demonstrating the powerful impact of environmental factors even in cases of significant genetic predisposition. A particularly notable aspect was the follow-up of the young women who left the property in 1958. Martha Blackwood, whose difficult birth experience had initiated the entire process, eventually settled in Birmingham, where she received treatment for her medical conditions and learned basic sewing skills. Although never able to live completely independently due to her limitations, she found purpose working in a craft program for people with disabilities. "I was born in a place where we didn't know there was another way to live. We believed we were as we should be. Now I understand that much of our suffering could have been avoided. I don't blame my parents or grandparents. They did what they believed was right. But I'm happy that our story can help other people understand the risks of this kind of isolation," reflected Martha, then 34 years old, in an interview given to a local newspaper in 1975. Other Blackwood children and young adults who received educational and medical intervention had varied outcomes. Some with more severe disabilities were eventually placed in specialized institutions when their family caregivers aged. Others achieved surprising levels of social integration, especially those who had been exposed to education earlier. The population of the Blackwood property gradually decreased. Of the 32 members who lived there when Dr. Harrington made his first visit in 1957, only 12 remained in 1975. Partially sold to neighboring farmers was the land, which had been kept isolated for so long, with a small central portion still occupied by descendants of the family. Ramifications beyond the immediate family were had by the case of the Blackwoods in the 1970s. It influenced public health policies in rural areas of Alabama, with specific programs being developed to identify and offer assistance to isolated communities. Training to recognize signs of consanguinity and address the issue in a culturally sensitive manner with affected communities was received by health professionals. Part of the medical genetics curriculum in medical schools across the southern United States became the case study of the Blackwoods, always presented with pseudonyms, dramatically illustrating the risks of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Thompson frequently commented that, "The story of the Blackwoods is both a lesson in genetics and a lesson in humility for medicine. A reminder that entire communities can exist on the margins of our health systems, facing suffering that could be mitigated with proper intervention." Permission from William Blackwood, then 65 years old and the last of Elijah's children still alive, was received by a team of documentarians from the University of Alabama in 1980 to create a historical and educational record about the family. Titled Isolation in the Mountains, A Story of Rural Alabama, a documentary was produced with sensitivity, maintaining the family's anonymity and focusing on the medical and social aspects of the case instead of exploiting the sensationalism of the physical deformities. The film, shown only in educational and medical contexts, included interviews with professionals who worked with the family and some members of the Blackwoods who consented to participate. One of the most eloquent participants was Rachel Blackwood, then 39 years old, who had become an informal advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in her community. "People look at families like ours and see only the strange, the different," she said before the cameras, her face with distinctive features but undeniable dignity. "They don't see the real people behind the appearances. Each of us has a story, dreams, fears. What happened to our family is a tragedy that could have been avoided with knowledge and support. I hope others can learn from our experience. The genetic legacy of the Blackwoods continued, albeit in a diluted form, in subsequent generations. The younger members who left the property and eventually formed families did so with unrelated partners, resulting in a rapid decline in the incidence of severe deformities in just one generation. A follow-up study conducted by Dr. Thompson in 1985, shortly before his retirement, documented 43 direct descendants of the Blackwoods living in various parts of Alabama. Of these, about 30% presented mild to moderate genetic conditions, a dramatic reduction compared to the almost 85% observed in the previous generation. The case of the Blackwoods, wrote Thompson in his final conclusions, demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of the human genome. In just one generation of genetic diversification, we observed significant improvements in the health and development of descendants. However, certain conditions persist, reminding us of the lasting impact that consanguinity practices can have across generations. The original Blackwood property, reduced to less than 10 acres, remained occupied until 1992 when the last resident, Thomas Blackwood, Elijah's great-nephew, passed away at 62 years old. The land was sold, and the original structures, deteriorated by time, were eventually demolished. Few physical signs remain today of the site that housed one of the most documented stories of family consanguinity in the United States. A silent experience is visiting the site where the Blackwood property once stood today. The mountains and forests remain indifferent to the human drama that unfolded there for decades. A small plaque placed by local historians in 2005 marks the site with a simple text: "On this site lived a family whose experiences significantly contributed to the medical understanding of genetic isolation and the importance of human diversity." Dispersed are the last known descendants of the Blackwoods, many having adopted new surnames and integrated into communities where their family history is unknown. Some maintained contact with each other, united by bonds of kinship and shared experiences that few outsiders could fully understand. A symposium on genetic isolation and public health, lessons learned and future challenges, was held by the University of Alabama School of Medicine in 2007, on the 50th anniversary of the initial discovery of the family by Dr. Harrington. Among the speakers was Michael Thompson, son of Dr. Walter Thompson and also a geneticist who had inherited his father's research files. "The case of the Blackwoods is not just medical history," he stated during the event. "It's a study on how isolation, geographic, social, and genetic, can shape human destinies. It's also a story about how compassionate intervention can alter trajectories that seemed inevitable. 50 years later, we are still extracting valuable lessons from this remarkable family." Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Blackwoods is educational. Their experiences, documented with scientific and ethical care, continue to teach new generations of health professionals about the impacts of consanguinity, the importance of genetic diversity, and the challenges of offering assistance to isolated communities. Profound questions about cultural autonomy versus human welfare, about the limits of isolation in a modern society, and about how practices established for generations can lead to unintended and devastating consequences are also confronted by the story of the Blackwoods. For the few who know their complete history, the Blackwoods are not remembered only for the physical deformities that made them objects of medical study, but for the human resilience they demonstrated in facing extraordinary circumstances, and for the courage of those who, like Martha and Rachel, dared to question established traditions and seek a different path. In a very real sense, the most deformed family in Alabama offers us not just a case study on the dangers of consanguinity, but also a mirror in which we can examine our own attitudes toward those who are different, our prejudices and fears, and our collective capacity both to cause suffering and to alleviate it through knowledge, understanding, and compassion. If you watched this far, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched it all the way through, so I can get to know you and know who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." Don't forget to also leave your like to support our work and share this video with people who are also interested in these real stories that reveal dark aspects of the human condition. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss any of our upcoming investigations into extraordinary cases like this one.